Where are the light switches? Okay. Do, re, mi. I don't know if that's on. Probably not. Oh, I probably don't need it, but it helps so I don't have to shout the whole time. All right. Hello. Welcome to, hopefully, I think I'm in the right place because I recognize Madison and Elizabeth, or Elizaveta? Elizaveta. I recognize both of them, and I saw that they were on the class list, so I think I'm in the right place. Okay, so welcome to SOC 377. All right, so a couple things for today. So obviously, this is a spring class, so we're going to do things in kind of, quick fashion, go through the course as quickly. Well, I mean, we're going to go through 3 hours twice a week, Mondays and Wednesdays, and all of this fun stuff. It goes by incredibly quick. And actually, I think this might be the last time this course is ever offered in the spring, because they've shifted it now to being offered in fall and winter. And I don't think they're going to offer you 3 times a year, but I could be wrong about that too. Oh God, teaching this class 3 times a year. I love this class, but I don't know about that. Okay, so, all right. I don't know how useful this is going to be this semester, but I'm going to leave it in there anyway. So, one of the things I do, because I find, people don't always love asking questions by putting their hands up, is I use this, which is Slido, for Q&A. And basically, we're going to try to use the same code for the entire course. But basically, you will, if you want to ask a question without putting up your hand, just go to slido.com and enter this code or QR code that thing. And it'll take you to kind of a Q&A page, and it will allow you to just write in questions. And every now and then, a Q&A slide comes up where if you type something, the question shows up, and I will answer the slide. I think I try to space them about every 3 or 4 slides. So I have them here and there. Okay, so who am I? I'm going to pause before I introduce myself. I have to admit, I'm like spinning a little bit. Oh, Chloe, you're here too. Hi. I'm spinning a little bit because I finished marking for my winter classes on Friday at 2:30 p.m. and got my grades in at like 4. And so I'm like, the gap between, winter and spring has not been particularly long for me. So I'm like, okay, I got to psychologically get ready to do this. And like, this was the course that was my last course to mark. So I just finished marking this course. So it feels a little bit weird to then like restart. So if I seem a little discombobulated today, it's because I haven't quite gotten my head around being back in spring. And winter was weird. I taught 5 courses in the winter, and I'm teaching 3 in the spring. So I know, it's crazy. I shouldn't do this to myself, but I apparently love pain. I don't know, that's maybe too deep an admission for the first day. Anyway, so 2 of them are online, so they shouldn't be that bad. I was here all day yesterday recording slides for SOC 100. So I got up to Foucault, and then I had to stop. Okay, so I spent about 45 minutes just talking about Foucault. I might have to redo it because I don't know, Foucault is something. But who am I? So I am, Jeff Broussard. I'm an associate teaching professor in the Department of Sociology. I've been in this department in some way, shape, or form. Like I started in grad school here in 2010. So now, oh my God, I've been here for a really long time, 15 years. I started teaching in the department in 2014, and I've been teaching this class since 2015. So where were you in 2015? Like, some of you were in like elementary school. I don't want to think about that. So, things have changed a little bit. So this is, this class, I will admit, is sort of my baby. In lots of ways. It is, I think, probably the class that's responsible for getting me the fabulous job that I have now because it's been, a popular one with students, and I really like teaching it. So hopefully that comes through. Okay, so because we're in spring, I'm not going to hold standard office hours where I sit in my office and wait for people to come to me. Basically, we're going to do it by appointment. And if you look on, I'm going to keep saying eClass, but it's Canvas. eClass is dead, I think. They've killed eClass now. I have a link at the top of the Canvas page that says appointment booking, and I have my availabilities put in there, and I'll change it around week by week as I need to. Bless you. But you can just click on that and find a time where, I'm available, you're available, and if you want to meet with me, especially after the exams, that's usually when people want to meet, and just to take a look at exams, you can click on there, and that is the best way. We can meet in person. My office is actually just over there in the Center for Criminological Research, or, we can meet on Google Meet. So if you're off campus and working and you want to squeeze in a meeting with your professor on your lunch break, because isn't that everyone's dream? We can do that as well. And if I don't have a time that works for you, you can just email me and, maybe we can find something else that works. And yeah, my office is in the CCR, which, this way, take a right, kind of towards the end of the hallway. Email is jrb5@ualberta.ca because, I have a terrible email address because I was doing my undergrad here when they rolled out email for the first time. And so they still hadn't given people like good email addresses. So after I came back, they just gave me back my old one. So I'm stuck with this terrible email address, probably until I retire. I'm not going to lie, which, hopefully is not for a while. Okay, no questions. Perfect. All right, so I'm going to tell you a little bit about the course. It's really, really straightforward. We're going to do things, very similar to how I do them in winter, just in a condensed format. And then, we'll start in on course material today. Oh, one thing I should say. Somewhere around, 2:30, we're going to take like a 15, 20-minute break so everybody can go refresh coffee, stretch your legs. I will inevitably need more beverage as well because talking for 3 hours is going to be a bit of a stretch for me as well. Okay, so this class, really straightforward. We got three exams, really. They're really 3 midterms, but the last one I call a final exam just because it's at the end of the course. And the dates, May 21st, so that first day that we, I guess the Wednesday after we come back from the Victoria Day weekend, June 2nd, and then June 13th. And basically how I'll do it, I'll tell you about the exam format in a second, and I will kind of, in the class before, I'll provide you some examples of the type of questions you might see, just so you have an idea of how to answer them. Okay, the exams are 5 short answer questions each. They're 90 minutes. Oh, by the way, I love writing on my slides, so I hope that's okay. Otherwise, you're going to have a miserable time in the course because I doodle on my slides all the time. I draw arrows, I circle things, I highlight. Since I got this pen, I've gone a little crazy with the drawing on slides. I kind of love it a little bit too much. Okay, so 90 minutes. The way we'll do it for this class is I have the exams as open book. And generally speaking, when I do them in the fall and winter semesters in this format, the exams are open for a 24-hour period. So for 24 hours, and so basically from midnight to 11:59 is the kind of window where you can do it. Once you start, you get 90 minutes, right? So pretty straightforward and simple. They're open book. Generally, people want to do them at home. And on the days of the exams, right, so on the 21st, what I'll do is, I will be here for the first half of the class, right, from, 1 until 2:30. Just if someone wants to write in here, you want to ask questions, I will be kind of hanging out in here. And then once we hit 2:30, we'll start, our regularly scheduled class. But you can still write it for, that 24-hour period. My reasoning being I don't want you to have to do extra work, right? I don't want to do a full 3-hour lecture that day and you have to do a 90-minute exam, because I don't want the spring class to be punishing. I think it's punishing enough to come twice a week for 3 hours and listen to me. I was going to make a joke. I'll make lots of those, but so I don't want you to have like extra class time or extra time for this course that day. So we're gonna start at 2:30 on the days of the exams, and we'll only do an hour and a half class on the days that we have midterms booked, because I feel like that's fair and I don't want to overwhelm you. So fun times. Oh yeah, the exams are made up of 5 short answer questions each, and I will give you examples of both the questions and how to answer them prior to the exams. And the exams are not cumulative, right? So we don't, especially the final exam, we're not going all the way back to the things we're learning about today or talking about today to answer those questions. Some concepts might carry over and you might want to use some concepts from the beginning of the course and the second midterm to answer things on the final, but it's not mandatory and not required. Okay, any questions? I know you're all in the room. Any questions about the exam formats? No.
I guess just out of curiosity, for the exams, is there going to be like a minimum word count for answers?
No. I generally don't put like a minimum word count, and specifically because, okay, how to put this? Because people will viciously try to reach the minimum word count even if they have fully answered the question and they're like 100 words short or something, or 50 words short. So then I get 50 garbage words or 100 garbage words or just a bunch of gibberish that actually makes it harder for me to mark. So I generally have it as like, if you think you've written enough, you think you fully answered the question, stop. If you still think you need to keep going, keep going. So I don't love minimums and maximums, and I know that stresses people out. But I find otherwise you get a really strange sort of like 500 or like say 250 amazing words and then like 200 words of complete gibberish because you've run out of things to say. So I don't have kind of minimums and maximums. I sort of leave it to your discretion as like, I think I've answered this fully. When I outline how to answer the questions, like, oh, how much to tell you today? No, it's not intimidating. It should be fine. Like I almost always have the questions structured in either like 2 or 3 parts. So I'll show you generally splitting your answer up into like, 2 or 3 parts. Generally people write like 300-ish words for it, but don't take that as like a hard guide. Sometimes people write way more, and sometimes people, I don't know how. It's 90 minutes, but some people apparently type really fast, or AI, I don't know. I will say that my exam questions are increasingly not so much about me and you as they are about me and my war against AI and trying to word questions in such a way as AI is going to be really, really confused and spit out absolutely terrible answers. Or you're going to have to spend a lot of time uploading notes and trying to make, some sense of the slides to AI. But it's mostly now, just me versus Chat GPT. That's how you'll see when I show you the questions, you'll get a sense of my battle against AI and how it's like using concepts from this course. Take that, Chat GPT. You didn't take the course. Haha, victory. I don't know. There's probably ways around this, but I will continue my war against AI. Or, as some of the older members of the department are suggesting, should I do my old man voice? No, I won't. That we should have you all come in and write on paper, in class, in person. And I'm like, oh, but have you seen their handwriting? These are people that teach like 4 students, right? It's like, I have my seminar of 3 students and I have them write on paper. I'm like, okay, I have my 300 level class of 140. I don't want to die. So honestly, I used to mark things in handwriting, and I will never forget the one person whose handwriting honestly looked like this. Every single letter, I don't know how, looked like tiny lines. It's like this was a B, this was an S, and I'm like, they were an engineer. I'm like, I don't know what is going on. And I'm like, you know what? We're moving to computers now. This is who I am. Okay, I'm sorry. Did I answer your question? Okay. Like I said, I'm a little bit today. I just fixed something on the syllabus like at 12:52 and re-uploaded it because I'm like, oh, that's wrong. This is what happens when you have like one day to turn around from one semester to another. Okay, any other questions? Yeah, please.
So is it 300 words per part or per question?
Oh, it'd be per question. Like you only have 90 minutes, right? And there's 5 questions, so you don't have that much time. But again, 300 is not a hard barrier. That's just like people tend to write about that much. But don't feel like you're like, oh my, I have 250 words. I now need 50 more words. And then, you just like quote the lyrics to a Taylor Swift song or something to just, are there 50 words in a Taylor Swift song? I don't even know. Okay. My daughter would hate me for saying that. She loves Taylor Swift. Okay. Other questions? Okay. One day I will be old man yells at cloud. When I started teaching this class, that was definitely my dad. And I'm like, wow, that's increasingly me. Okay. So the course, right? Obviously we're talking about youth, and we're going to, maybe I've taken it upon myself to kind of spread the concept of youth out a little bit because the department doesn't have a class on, childhood at the moment. So we're going to kind of look at, the concept of youth pretty broadly, going back to like childhood and sort of moving all the way through, so at some points we're going to be talking about, people from like 7 years old to about 29 years old, right? So we're constructing youth in a really broad way. And I'll kind of explain, as we go through. We have this concept that emerged about 15 years ago called emerging adulthood to describe people like 19 to 29, because it's like you're not quite adults, but you're not obviously teenagers anymore. So we're not quite sure what to do with you. So we just created a new category. So we're going to kind of talk about this category of youth, as a social category, as a construct, and looking at, I guess the lives and things that are affecting young people. Lots of kind of topics, and I'll show you the topics in a second, kind of trying to break down how young people move through different aspects of life. Okay, so we're going to start today with a kind of history of youth and childhood, right? That's going to be our number one. How did we get here? So we're going to go back a long ways. We're going to go back to like the Middle Ages, right? And kind of look at what, where our modern concept of childhood comes from, because it's not as apparent as you think it is, right? So we're going to talk about that, and we're going to take our discussion right from the kind of, the late Middle Ages, through the Enlightenment, through the Industrial Revolution, into the 19th century, and sort of pick up our account, in the second sort of set of lectures called The Cultural World of Generations. We're going to pick up talking about basically all of our living generations that we have today, from the silence all the way to Gen Z. And depending on how long this takes, because I actually have a bunch of stuff on Gen Alpha, I might add, if it doesn't take till, we don't get through Gen Z today, I might add Gen Alpha for next time, right? So Gen Z is obviously, I would say, hang on, let me check. Okay, I would say everybody in this room other than me is probably Gen Z. At very worst, there might be one very young millennial in here, but probably you're all Gen Z. And then Gen Alpha is the generation that roughly starts, let's say, about 2011, roughly, because they're just 13 now. Okay, so talk about that, and then we will talk about education. Now, typically, this kind of chunk of the course, or it did last semester anyway, will take us all the way to that kind of first midterm, these 3 topics. So especially this one, talking about the different generations, from the silence the baby boomers, Gen X, millennials, Gen Z, and what they were like as young people and how that's had kind of long-term effects on, the development of the generations after them, and how they interacted with the world based on what they experienced as young people. That takes a bit. It's a pretty long kind of lecture series. Okay, that's usually midterm 1, though, things are always different every single semester. Sorry, I heard a sound and I had a dog from Up moment where I'm like, squirrel. Okay, more coffee. That's what I need. I need to raise my heart rate a little more. Okay, so part 2, we'll talk about families. I just redid this last semester on the fly, talking about families. So I think I've now come up with a sort of interesting, very modern take on the families unit. I think it's a lot of fun. We'll talk about work, wherein you get to hear about all the horrors that are in store for you once you leave the ivory halls of the University of Alberta, or should I say the crumbling brick halls of the Tory building where there are no working bathrooms. I don't know. Ivory Tower sounds better than what we actually have. A crumbling brick structure with no bathrooms sounds bad. So we'll talk about work, talk a little bit about religion and spirituality. And I mean, if you know me, this is one of my sort of happy place topics. I also teach sociology of religion this year in the winter, so that's a long ways away. So religion and spirituality, a particular topic of interest for me. I also teach a class on youth and sociology of youth and religion through St. Joseph's College. So lots of things to say. And then, kind of ending off that section, talking about sex and intimacy, wherein we have I don't know if you, but I will have a good time talking about such fun topics as, hookup culture, porn, and there's one other one. Now, why can't I remember? There's another other topic that's in there. And what we call, what Mark Regnerus calls cheap sex. So it's kind of a fun, I don't know, I have fun with it anyway. It's a fun and interesting topic. All right, and then we'll end kind of the course, so what's on the final exam, a little bit about crime, stuff that I took from when I taught SOC 321 back a few years ago. I think I taught it up until 2022. We'll talk about youth and health, mostly mental health, and youth and technology. Oh, I had 3 units here. It might just be 2. Because I trimmed it down last semester and I didn't catch that when I was revising my slides. We're going to talk about technology, particularly about the influence of smartphones and social media, and looking at a book from Jonathan Haidt called The Anxious Generation, about y'all, about Gen Z, and about the fact that smartphones are ruining your everything. So, we can always take that with a bit of a grain of salt. So, honestly, if you have something that I'm doing that's driving you crazy, do let me know. I try to be accommodating of requests. When I started teaching, people reacted to this a lot more. And now, I don't know, maybe I've gotten so good, there's nothing to improve. I don't know. Probably not. But if you have anything that I'm doing that's driving you a little bit crazy that I can, maybe change, do let me know and I will try to do it. If you need me to post something extra, right, in the SOC 100 class that I'm doing, someone asked me, could you post the slides without your pen scribbles on them? I was like, yes, I can do that. That's not too hard, right? So if there's something I can do that will make your learning experience better, do let me know and I will do what I can. I'll give you, I think the first example I had of this is when I started teaching, I was like, I'm going to make my slides beautiful. So there were all these like dark colored backgrounds. And I had a student that was printing the slides. And he's like, could you please put them on white because you're murdering my printer? And I was like, yes, I could do that. White is easy. And apparently this is like universal design, high contrast slides. So black on white is a good one. But if there's something else, that you need, if you need a longer break in the middle, right, if you're getting exhausted by my rather staccato and fast-paced talk, do let me know, and we can work on that. Now, if you're like, could you just give us all an A in the course? If only. I wish I could do that, but the university says I'm not allowed. Okay. Any other questions before I kind of jump into content? My preamble took me half an hour, and then we'll jump in. We'll do an hour of lecture, and then we'll take a break and see where we end up. Any questions at all? Hello. Yes.
I'm sorry, like if you mentioned this already, but there's no like required textbook.
No, I hate textbooks.
All the readings are just on.
Do you love textbooks? Okay. I could give you just a book to buy if you want to buy something. No. One of the problems, no, and thank you for the question. Yeah, I've put all the readings on eClass or Canvas. I miss you, eClass. eClass was better in some ways. I'm just discovering this. I'm like, I did the whole 2-semester transition to Canvas, and every time I go to do something, I'm like, wait, I could do this on eClass. Why can't I do this on Canvas? Anyway, I might reorganize Canvas just to move I might move the lectures to like week 1, week 2, week 3, and then move the readings in there, but they're all kind of listed at the top of there. And I mean, I was using a textbook for this for years, but now that textbook was published in 2014, and it's wildly out of date. It was like this newfangled app, Snapchat. Like, okay, I think it's time to move on from this textbook. Apparently they're revising it, but I got to see a draft of it, and it's terrible because they've revised like 3 things. And they're like, now it's like that newfangled app, TikTok. I'm like, okay, guys, like, can you get someone under the age of 75 to rate this textbook, please? I'm not volunteering. I have too much to do. Anyway, no textbooks. All the readings are online. And generally speaking, like the material you need to do the exams is all in the lectures, right? So if you listen to me, you will find it there. Other questions? Any others before I start talking about the history of youth and childhood? No? Going once? Going twice? Going thrice? No, okay. All right. Well, why do I always construction noise everywhere I am on campus? If your Wi-Fi dies, apparently they're updating the Wi-Fi in the building, so that should be fun. Okay. Oop, I think I have a different code. Whatever. Okay. All right, just have to check something here. Nope. Yeah, that's not going to work. Oh dear. Oh, there it is. Okay. Huzzah. Sorry, you can't see what I'm doing. That's good. All right. Okay. Let me just... There we go. Okay. So we're going to start talking a little bit about a history of kind of youth and childhood, right? Trying to figure out where this concept of childhood and youth as we think of them today comes from, because they do have a history, right? These concepts, while they might seem really apparent because you live them every day and they seem obvious, they were not always the way that they are. Okay, so, oh, sorry, I hadn't changed this code. So this is a different code if you want to log into that. It'll be back in a second. All right, so we're going to talk, sorry, I'm going to go back. We're going to talk a little bit about an account of history that's given in this book, which is the disappearance of childhood by Neil Postman. Now, it's a relatively old book, right? It was written in 1980, or published in 1980. So it's relatively old, but I think it does a sort of relatively friendly job of talking about where our kind of modern notion of childhood comes from and how it's much more historically contingent than we might otherwise think. Now, as you can probably guess, the thesis of the book is that childhood is in itself sort of disappearing, essentially because of a reversal of the social changes that led to the appearance of childhood in the first place. Now, I don't think the that part of the book holds up as well as the first part of it, but we'll talk about kind of Postman's account of where childhood comes from. Okay, so who's Neil Postman? So he was an American kind of educator, right? A degree in education and cultural critic who spent, most of his life in New York City, specifically at New York University. Especially known for his sort of criticisms of media systems. Probably his most famous book is this one, Amusing Ourselves to Death, which if you either have taken or take SOC 444 with me, you get to read a little bit out of Amusing Ourselves to Death. It's an interesting book about how Postman thought television was going to cause, the decline in our civilization. He had yet to meet the internet and things like YouTube and TikTok, but that's neither here nor there, a subject for another time. Obviously, this one that we're talking about, and then, these two books, again, about kind of technology and the way they change cultures. Okay, so Postman kind of starts his account, right, his history of childhood by suggesting, right, that he's going to talk about childhood in a relatively broad sense as basically this period from about 7 years old to about 17, right? So in some ways, this is going to overlap nicely with what we're going to talk about in the course, except that it's going to end a little bit earlier, right? Because we're going to expand out that definition to include everyone, not children so much, but in terms of youth, we're going to include everyone from 18 to 29. So I think the important thing about Postman's kind of account here is he kind of breaks away, and he's not unique in doing this. I think Philip Aries, on whose work Postman is basing a lot, kind of did this before, but Postman, I think, popularizes it. Splits off the idea that childhood is a biological category, right? That basically, little people who are small are children. Why? Because they're still growing up. And he's much more interested in thinking of, childhood as something that's socially constructed, that has certain social categories because of the way we perceive it and the way we define it, but didn't always exist and doesn't necessarily have to exist in the way we think about it in the future. Okay, I have to tie my shoe because I'm about to trip over my own shoelaces, so I'll try to do that really quickly here. Okay, and see if I can talk at the same time. So, Postman wants to kind of establish a notion of where childhood comes from in Western society, right? So I will say of this book, it's probably a bit Eurocentric. It is very much a book written by, an American scholar in the 20th century and one who, has a great fondness for Western culture. But he wants to kind of set up, like, where did our current notion of childhood come from? And because, I think like a lot of people from his generation, he's a bit of a classicist, right? He understands the influence of Greco-Roman culture on kind of our modern notions of a lot of things today. He goes back and he kind of looks at the Greeks, right? And what he suggests is, in ancient Greece, right, where we often think of kind of Western cultures as being rooted, there wasn't what you would properly call a notion of childhood in ancient Greek culture. The Greeks, for all of their wonders, have kind of this broad concept of youth. Bless you. All right. The broad concept of youth, and it's sort of like a vague thing. Almost anyone could be a youth, right? Youth was a time for citizens, right? Only applies to citizens of city-states like Athens or Sparta or Thebes, not, slaves or women, male citizens only. But youth was a time when people were educated, right? So when you would go and, at least in theory, sit at the feet of some philosopher and learn his philosophy, probably learn some geometry, a little bit of math, and basically, this could be anywhere from 10 to 40, right? You could still be considered a youth. It just depended on where you were in your kind of education. But they didn't have a specific word that meant, child in the way that we think of it. And you sometimes see this, right? So if you know a bit about the New Testament, right? You see this in one of the letters of Paul, right? And it's sometimes translated as, when I was a child, I thought like a child, I acted as a child. When I became a man, I put behind me childish things. The word that Paul is using there is actually pedos, right? From which we get, the words pediatric and also pedophile. Same Greek root. But pedos in Greek actually means, infant in a kind of broadly construed way, right? And again, infant is a weird kind of concept in Greek culture. Infant would be from 0 to maybe 6 or 7 years old, right? Because they didn't have this kind of really defined notion of okay, we have, newborns, we have infants, then we have toddlers, and then we have, preschoolers, and then we have children, and then da-da-da-da-da, right? They don't have this kind of delineation. You basically have, you have pedos, and then you have, man. You're grown up. After you're a pedos, you're grown up. So it's kind of weird. We've translated that particular passage of the New Testament in a really kind of interesting way to reflect kind of our modern conceptions, like when I was a child. But what Paul actually means there is infant. So they have babies, they have infants, they have adults. They don't have a whole lot in between. And then you have this notion of youth, which is 10 to whenever you're done being educated. You could be 25, 30, 40, and you would still be a youth because you're still doing a youthful thing, right? So it's more of a behavioral category. Okay. So surely, the Greeks didn't have this concept. Surely the Romans did. And this is kind of true according to Postman. The Romans had a somewhat different kind of notion of childhood and youth than the Greeks did, even though the cultures are deeply kind of linked. Now, why? Now, Postman, there's a bunch of reasons. One of the things that Postman says is the Romans had a sense of shame, right? That basically, because of how their culture had developed, there was a sense that some people shouldn't know about some topics, right? Particularly things like sex, politics, economics, and war were, the purview of, men, really. And they weren't appropriate to speak of, with, the young or with women, because the Romans were pretty sexist. It was bad to divulge too much information to children. Oop. You couldn't see the screen for the last 5 minutes. When was this note put there? Hang on. Oh, sorry, I have to fix something. Okay. I think that's someone who discovered that I also stream this online, even though I didn't tell you I do. Pay no attention to the man behind the curtain. So, what was I saying? I need to see the next slide. Okay, I actually need to tell you something about the Romans. One of the things that Postman suggests probably has to do with why the Romans had a much more similar notion of childhood than we do. A notion that, young people need to be protected from certain things and really raised up until a certain point when they can interact with adult topics, Postman thinks is broadly a function of empire, right? And hang on a minute. Wow. Just want to clear this off. Right? It's a function of the Roman Empire and the fact that the Roman Empire needed a lot of literate people. And by ancient standards, the Roman Empire has a lot of literate people, especially amongst the kind of citizen class in the Roman Empire. You're looking at probably somewhere, 10, 15% of the population being literate, which by ancient standards, where it was like 2, 3% being literate, is pretty high. And why? Well, they had an empire to maintain. And because the Romans, right, if you ever, take a quick Google of a map of the Roman Empire at its peak, right, it stretches from Britain, from Great Britain in the north, all the way to, basically the Saharan desert, right? They control most of North Africa, Egypt, through the Mediterranean basin, up through kind of the Middle East, Israel, Palestine, Syria. The Romans control all of that. And it is a far-flung empire. And the only way to communicate information and to kind of keep that empire together is by the transmission of written documents, right? So basically, there is this back and forth kind of traffic in scrolls and other orders, between Rome and, the periphery. So, the emperor needs to be told, what's going on in Judea. So somebody, writes down, and because he needs to issue orders as to what's to be done. So someone writes him a letter, right? It's taken on the Roman roads that stretch all across the empire, from Judea to Rome. And then the emperor writes down his orders and sends it back again. So to do that, you need a lot of literate scribes, right? You need people who can write down things on papyrus, obviously in Latin, and kind of send it back and forth. Now, what that does, according to Postman, is it means you need, when you have literacy, you need schools in some kind of sense, right? You need a way to educate all of those scribes. And once you get schools, you start to have this period of time that's set aside where young people are taught things like basic skills like literacy. And that's essentially what we find in the Roman Empire, right? Education, especially again for citizens. Citizens are not the majority of the Roman population, but those people who are citizens are generally educated, can read and write, and this allows the Roman Empire to coordinate. And so they have this sense of like, oh, there's this period of time where young people, don't know anything, and we have to teach them things, and we control the information they're taught, and there are some things that we shouldn't talk to them about because it's not good for them, right? And these things are, sex, politics, economics, and war, and all of those things. The things that are still not really polite things to talk about at dinner parties. Okay. Huzzah. Okay. So, this notion of kind of childhood the Romans have, though, doesn't last. And it will actually disappear for a really long time. And why? Well, because the Roman Empire collapses, right? In the year 476, the western part of the Roman Empire, right, everything kind of, that would include Western Europe today, Italy, France, Spain, Britain, all of that stuff basically ceases to exist. And the Roman Empire goes away, when I can't remember which Germanic warlord, walks into Ravenna and tells the last Western Roman Empire, Romulus, that he better go find himself a new job because, it's the Visigoths who are in charge now. So the Roman Empire collapses in 476, and basically Western Europe is sort of fundamentally transformed, right? A lot of the kind of infrastructure of, the whole Roman Empire had been set up in such a way as to support the empire, as to keep the empire going. There's a lot of big cities, in Western Europe that basically empty out with the collapse of the Roman Empire. Why? Because they were really useful for one thing, which was garrisoning Roman legions and, providing centers through which the Roman Empire could tax everybody. And this all kind of disappears. And what happens is Western Europe breaks up into a bunch of small feudal kingdoms, right? Ruled by kings and warlords. And basically, for 1,000 years, there is no dominant power in Europe. There are moments where different powers kind of rise up, but there isn't something like the Roman Empire for a long time, right? So it gets reorganized from an imperial Roman system to feudalism. You don't have far-flung empires to administer anymore, so you don't need as many people that can read and write. And the Catholic Church, right, which sort of rises out of the ashes of the Roman Empire, becomes probably the strongest institution, the one that dominates daily life. But for the Catholic Church, you don't need that many people who are literate. You have an elite scribal class, mostly monks and priests who are able to read and write. And so literacy, which had been relatively high by ancient standards, plunges. Now, for Postman, this has a kind of a weird effect. Without reading, we go back to essentially oral culture, where everything is communicated in spoken terms, right? So basically, most people will never learn to read and write in an oral culture. All of the instruction, storytelling, everything you need to know is communicated basically, person to person by word of mouth. And what Postman suggests is beyond, basic language skills, which you'll master, kind of basic language enough to get by about 6 or 7. There's no real hierarchy to language, right? Because you learn it just by kind of being around it. You learn everything you kind of need to know for most people without any kind of formal education. So it kind of breaks down. We go from a reading culture to an oral one, and society fundamentally reorients in a couple of different ways. So, for one, everybody lives in pretty close quarters, right? There's not really that many big estates. Most people are really, really poor, and they probably live in a 1 or 2 bedroom hut or shack of some kind on land that their family has been farming for decades or centuries. So there's really no sense of private or personal space. And this matters, right? Because it means that everybody kind of knows everything, right? If you're sleeping in a 1 or 2 bedroom hut, how to put this politely, there's no polite way. You probably have a pretty good sense of where your brothers and sisters came from, because your parents were just over on the other side of the hut, doing that thing that made your brothers and sisters. So there's no private space. There's no shielding of anything, right? There's nowhere, once we get to like the 19th century, 18th and 19th century, you start to get this idea of like, the men will go off to talk politics. If you ever watch Downton Abbey, right, you kind of see this. The men go off to talk about politics and economics in the smoking room, right? And they have their brandy and cigars and they smoke and talk politics. There's none of that really in the Middle Ages, right? Everything is in these public spaces. And Postman talks about, kind of accounts and illustrations from the period where everybody, comes together for common meals. And it's not unusual, say, for adults to be, getting handsy with relatively young children, right? Grabbing their butts or genitals or whatever it happens to be. And this is not seen as a particular problem in the Middle Ages. So children are not shielded at all from the adult world, and you don't have education in a hierarchical sense, except for a very small minority of people, right? And again, people who end up becoming monks and priests, yes, but for most people, they never need to learn how to read and write. Okay. That is until, kind of starting around 1440. So, 1440, what happens? Well, in 1440, a little German tinkerer, I guess he's a goldsmith by trade, named Johannes Gutenberg invents a little thing called the printing press. And we know, precious little actually about Gutenberg, which is kind of one of those weird historical things. We know that, he's kind of dumb in some ways. So we actually don't even know the exact date of the invention of the printing press. We think it's around 1440. What happens is Gutenberg is a sort of like, I guess you would think of him as not an innovator, what's the word I'm looking for? An entrepreneur, a medieval entrepreneur. And he, is looking to make his fortune. And what he realizes is that one thing that everybody wants to get their hands on is the Bible. Because prior to his little invention of the printing press, if you wanted, a copy of the Bible, it had to be hand copied. Now, if you've ever held or looked at a Bible, you can imagine how long it would take a human being to hand copy a Bible, which is made even worse in the Middle Ages by the fact that not only were people hand copying Bibles, they were also doing what's called illuminating them. So they were drawing like beautiful pictures and writing everything in like beautiful script as they're copying the Bible, right? These are called illuminated manuscripts. They're beautiful, right? You can see them in some European museums at this point. It took a really long time. And Gutenberg's like, if I could find a way to make a whole lot of Bibles, there's this religious fair going on in one of the neighboring towns in Bavaria, and I could go to this religious festival and I could sell all of these Bibles, and it's one of those things like print Bibles, go to fair, ? Profit, sort of thing for Gutenberg. And he does this, right? So basically he's a goldsmith by trade, and he comes up with this idea of movable type. So basically he makes a bunch of letter shapes, and then, we'll rearrange them to make all of the words on a page. And he goes and he produces a number of Bibles. And then he loads up now to do this, he puts it together with a wine press. He takes a wine press and he's stamping the pages using this wine press and his movable type. So this costs a lot of money. And Gutenberg had to borrow all that money from creditors, right? Probably at this point, they're, Medici bankers, so Italian quasi-mobster bankers. And so he borrows a bunch of money, and he goes off to this religious festival in, Bavaria, gets there and discovered that he got the year wrong. The festival had actually been in the previous year, and so he is forced to turn around, head home, having sold 0 Bibles, and now being in massive, massive debt. And this is the part where Gutenberg's part of the story actually, ends. Because what happens when he gets home is what you typically would have happen if you owed people a lot of money, right? If you don't pay for your car, they come and take your car. Well, his creditors come and they're like, well, you have no money, but we'll take that fancy printing device that you've created. And basically, they almost immediately realize what Gutenberg did, even though he had no business sense, that if you take this beautiful device that Gutenberg has created and you print a bunch of stuff, lots of people are going to want to buy books. And, very, very quickly, printing explodes in Europe. Within a century, right, within 100 years, there's printing presses in every country in Europe, and they are churning out printed material. So I wrote it in really big letters here. It changes everything in Europe, right? And Europe, in a lot of ways, is sort of the perfect storm for printing for a lot of reasons. There's stuff that people want to read, right? You have a bunch of, texts that have sort of been rediscovered recently in medieval Europe. Things like the works of Aristotle and Plato, all of the Greek and Roman philosophers. Some of it has come out of the monasteries in Ireland. Others other copies of it have come, to the West through Arabic translations that have been preserved in the Muslim world. And then the Byzantines, right? So the western or the eastern part of the Roman Empire centered in Constantinople, what would be modern day Istanbul, falls to the Ottoman Turks in 1453. It's only 13 years after the invention of the printing press. And because they're Greek speaking, they had all of these texts for a long time. And all of these monks and scholars from, the East come into the West fleeing kind of Muslim rule and bring with them copies of these books. So suddenly you have copies of all of these books that people really want to read and a technology with which to reproduce them. They also have paper. The technology to make paper and ink, actually, had both kind of come over the Silk Road from China. And the Western Europeans had the technology to make both paper and ink, so they have the materials. And more importantly, right, they have a market. Because the whole thing runs on money. And they have things like credit and all of these sorts of financial innovations that make it possible to print stuff. And they do. And it goes kind of crazy. Now, what does this have to do with youth and childhood at the end of the day? So, what Postman contends is that it's printing that creates a separation between children and adults, right? Because you start to get this point where, in oral culture, the knowledge of a 7-year-old and the knowledge of a 17-year-old isn't going to be all that different because it's just whatever you can absorb through your environment. When it comes to print has to be learned slowly, right? You learn how to read really gradually, right? Kids, I guess I've got one now. My youngest kid is 5 years old. He's just starting to learn how to read. It's a pretty slow process, right? You start with books that have like 10 words in them, and you kind of build up the ability over years and years. So adult knowledge separates from the common knowledge in major ways. And reading for Postman becomes the basis for entering adulthood, right? You have to be kind of trained in reading to be able to function socially and especially economically, right? Because as we go forward from 1440, the later and later we get after that, the more, you need literacy to just be functional from an economic perspective, right? By the time you get to like the 18th and 19th century, if you're illiterate, you're at a major economic disadvantage, right? You are cut off from whole parts of the marketplace. Okay, so children, right, can speak and understand speech, but children need to be taught to read. And so they become a separate category of people, right? You have the people who can read and the people who can't. The people who can't are children, and you start to develop institutions that are going to move them through that process. So ultimately, our kind of modern idea of childhood, I wrote that wrong, is a response to a technology, according to Postman. And here it is the technology of print and the printed word. Okay. Sorry, any questions? I'm just like blasting through. Any questions in the room before I keep going? Okay, if not, then we keep going. So, I will always love this graphic for no apparent reason. This nun that has the word shame on it, I don't know why. It just amuses me. So, Postman thinks there are basically 3 conditions that you need to have childhood in the way that we think about it. So first off, right, there's the return of that idea of shame, right? So shame, there need to be things that children shouldn't know. Okay, so you have to have things that children shouldn't know, and if you tell a child something they shouldn't know, that is shameful, right? That is bad, Oh, you can't see that. The green's not showing up. All right, we're going to go back to red. It's shameful. Right? To tell kids about I always think of this in terms of one of my friends who had a kid. He was about 5 years old at the time. He must be, must be like 17 or 18 now. And he was at 5 years old. He was letting his kid play Grand Theft Auto. Okay, your reaction is exactly what Postman is talking about, right? There are things in Grand Theft Auto that are clearly not appropriate for a 5-year-old, right? Beating up prostitutes, killing police officers, running people over with your car, probably not things you want a 5-year-old to be aware of their existence, right? And I remember going over and, my kids were like babies at the time, so they weren't coming over, but one of his other friends had a son about the same age. He's like, oh, don't worry, they're just playing Grand Theft Auto. And she was like, I'm sorry, what now? Yeah, that's not happening. Right? Because there are some things that kids shouldn't know about, right? So, kids shouldn't know about certain things. You need that for childhood, because otherwise, if everything's kind of open and free, what does it matter? Okay, literacy, right? And literacy is the tool with which information is controlled and meted out according to Postman, right? You eventually learn about things like sex and politics and war and, economies as you learn how to read, right? As you develop those skills of reading. And where are those skills developed? They are developed in school, right? Because we send our kids to school to develop those abilities. Okay.
So,
Brian.
these 3 conditions, you're saying that literacy allows you to learn shame, correct?
Well, okay. It's a good question. So, hang on. I'm going to erase my doodles. So, literacy is how you control information, right? So, think about it this way. Think about the kids section at, the public library, right? At the public library, you're going to have books like The Monster at the End of This Book or Blue's Clues or something more contemporary. I'm clearly very old. Right, in the kids section. And that's going to, teach about things like friendship and kindness and sharing and all of that stuff, right? And we have a kids section because we're like, this is the appropriate information for children to have, right? And as you move forward, right, and you go into the, 6 to, I don't even remember what the categories are, the 6 to 10 section, right? You're going to get books that are a little bit more, chapter books that have a little bit more nuance and sophistication and reveal a little bit more about the world, right? And then you get into the young adult readers or the teen readers, and suddenly you have sparkly vampires and bad relationship advice, right? My daughter, who's 15, recently discovered the Twilight series, not in a good way. She's been hate watching them with her friends. So we've had a bunch of teenage girls over at our house laughing till 3 a.m. watching these terrible vampire movies that are filled with terrible relationship advice. Now the good thing is they know that it's terrible, and none of them are aspiring to be Bella, thank God. But right, you know, Edo the pedo, is something that obviously you wouldn't present to a 6-year-old, right? You would present that to a young adult or a teenager. Or I guess YA novels, right? And then you would get into adult books where you now have war and sexuality and all of these things, right? So Postman says we sort of build literacy is a way of controlling it, right? We introduce topics and we as the adults control what is introduced and when, right? Does that make sense?
Absolutely.
Perfect. I love it. And we do that largely through school, right? Because it's like, all right, at school, here's your readers that you get, right, for this age and this age. And we're going to introduce more and more sophisticated topics over time. It's a great question. Other questions? Okay. So, this word, fun word, incunabula, which basically just means the cradle. The incunabula of childhood, right? So, what Postman suggests is that this shift from oral to an emerging print culture creates this new social category of children, right? As a class that needs to be taught to function in a print culture. And what you see in European societies is that relatively quickly, by historical standards, you see a sort of shift in social priorities, right? And education starts to become a very important goal. Now, this isn't done necessarily for, how we say, pure reasons. Largely, it's about economics, right? The more literate people you have in your society, the better your economy is going to perform because they can do more complex tasks, right? They can learn more complex things. They can invent new products and new systems and new machines and all of this fun stuff, right? So it becomes an important social goal, at a national level for a lot of places because it gives them an edge over their rivals. All right, and our Scottish Presbyterians, right, call for a national system, like basically public education, in 1560, which is only 120 years after roughly the beginning of the print era. And I think, not for nothing, right, if we look at, a lot of the key inventions of say, the Industrial Revolution, things like the steam engine, right, these things are invented largely by Scots. So, Scotland, ends up being quite ahead of this, as does Britain or the United Kingdom in lots of ways. Okay, so pretty obviously, where literacy is high, you have schools, right? That seems pretty obvious. And where there are schools, right, you start to get this kind of development of discourses that you can trace historically about children and how children are different than adults. And it's, again, not for nothing that a lot of this really starts happening in England, right? Okay, and you see the development here, right? 40 years after the development of the printing press, there are only 34 schools in England, right? Very, very few. By 1660, right? So again, 2 centuries after the invention of the printing press, there are 444, one about every 12 miles, right? So that's relatively dense for a society at this point, right? Again, nothing like what we would have today. You have a lot more schools today, but it's this kind of slow development. Okay, now the key here is that schools seem to fundamentally change the relationship of adults to children. And what Postman will suggest is that children go from being miniature adults to unformed adults. And one of the things that happens, right, is you start to get the development of all sorts of things through this period. One of them, and this is pointed out by Philip Aries in his book, which again, Postman is drawing on, in portraits of children, right, you get this distinct shift. So family portraits, people, especially rich people, would have their family portraits painted. And it used to be, prior to this kind of shift, that everybody was essentially wearing the same clothes, right? And then you get this kind of shift as this notion of childhood develops, where children are wearing different clothes than their parents, right? They're wearing children's clothes, and they start to look a little bit different. They're also, I don't know how to put this, not involved in the economy, right? So in the medieval period, sorry, I missed saying this in the medieval period. Once you were about 6 or 7, largely speaking, you would have been kind of an economic actor. you would have been either working on your family farm, right? So let's say prior to 1440, you would have been working on your family farm, or you would have been sent away by your family to apprentice in a trade, right? So you would have been sent off, to work with a master who would, teach you how to be a cobbler or a blacksmith or a miller or whatever other trades existed in the Middle Ages. My history of Middle Ages trades is apparently not what it should be. So you would go and be an economic actor, right? You would start working and you would start earning being part of, maybe not earning money, but contributing economically to the survival of your family and of yourself. So what happens once you get schools? And so I guess you're then a kind of miniature adult, right? You're small, but you're still contributing to the overall economy and the survival of your family, just like an adult would, just, at your capacity as a much smaller person. What happens with this transition is people start to think of people not so much as miniature adults, but rather unformed adults, right? People that still need to go through the process of maturing into adults. And what you start to get is, and again, it's gradual, it doesn't happen all at once. It's going to take a solid 500 years to go from, 1440 to what we think of as childhood today. But essentially, people kind of get to take their kids and keep them out of the economic system broadly for longer and longer periods of time. Right. So before that, under what we would call apprenticeship, childhood effectively ends at about 7. Once you start getting schools, children are shielded from the demands of the adult world for longer and longer, right? And again, this takes a really, really long time to unfold. It's not something that happens, overnight. It's going to take 5 centuries to go from there to here. And really, it's only kind of fully accomplished by around like 1950, right? So, I mean, if we go back a couple generations, like just in my family, my grandparents, right? So my mom's parents, my maternal grandfather ended his formal education in the 8th grade, and my grandmother finished her formal education in the 10th grade, right? Which by the standards of when they were, and again, this is only 2 generations back, right? My grandfather was born just at the tail end of the 19th century, which makes me feel even older, but whatever. It dawns on me that I was born in a different century too, so that kind of works out. Only in my parents' generation, right, with the baby boomers, do we get this kind of normalization that everyone is at least going to graduate from high school. And that was, kind of the minimum education that you needed. So it takes a really, really long time for it to play out. But through this period, right, people get shielded from the adult world for longer and longer periods, right? And as we move through this kind of historical process, that period gets longer and longer, specifically as you need more and more skills to function economically. Okay, the other thing that Postman says is learning becomes sequential and hierarchical. You get the establishment of curriculum or curricula, right? Basically being like, we need to teach this, then this, then this, because reading itself is kind of hierarchical, right? You have to learn the basic skills before you can move on to more complex things. So you start to move, from one skill, learn one skill before another. And this is, again, I'll give you some medieval trivia for no particular reason. The way education worked, say, for the Greeks, or even during the medieval period for someone like, say, Thomas Aquinas, right, the great medieval philosopher, was you would go and kind of talk to a teacher, and you would ask them questions, right? And they would go off and they would think about those questions and they would come back and answer the questions that you have, right? So you would ask, why is there something rather than nothing? And your philosopher teacher would be like, that's a great question. I'm going to go think about that for a week, come back in a week, and I'll answer that question. This actually sounds like a good gig, actually. You ask me some questions, I'll go off and think for a week, and then I'll come back with some answers for you, and we'll go from there. But that was how education was done, right? Once you get literacy being kind of the key skill, you get this hierarchical thing, right? We're actually going to organize learning in a very systemic way, starting with sort of like basic skills and working our way up, right? In a very organized, it's not like, you go to your geometry philosophy professor and be like, explain to me, the triangle. And they're like, great question. I will go think about the triangle for a week and then explain it to you, and we'll talk about, Pythagorean theorem and all of that stuff. No. Now it's organized in these very sequential ways where it's like you learn angles and then you learn, Pythagorean theorem and all of this stuff. So things are organized in terms of curricula. And very importantly, people notice things about kids. You start to group students by age where it's possible, right? Because it's like, when we look at 6-year-olds on average have roughly the same skill level, right? They have roughly the same ability to read and write and do math and all of those things. So let's cluster those people together and we'll call that the first grade, right? And then, we'll cluster these people together. We'll call them, junior high students, and we'll put them hopefully by themselves for 3 years and try to interact with them once they mature a little bit and aren't so horrible. And then, we have high school and we cluster people by ages, right? So you start to progress through the education system with peers of the same age. So rather than, you go sit at the feet of a philosopher like Thomas Aquinas and you're there with someone who might be 12 and another person's 45, right? And you're all studying under this, great philosopher. Now it's like, all of you are together and you're all 6 years old and you kind of move through it like that. Okay. I'm running out of coffee. Okay, so how are we doing? We will take a break shortly, in a few minutes. I will go. Okay, we'll go a few more slides, and then we'll take a little break. And if you want to run away and drop the class, you can do that too. I mean, you can do that anytime if you just want to walk out on me. I saw someone putting their laptop away right at the beginning, and I thought they were quitting, and I was in my preamble. I'm like, oh, no, they have an iPad. It's all good. I was like, oh no, they're walking out on me already. Have the jokes finally undermined me? I don't know. Okay, so separating young people into kind of classes, right, into grades. What you start to see is youth cultures start to emerge. And again, this is a slow process. It really comes to a head in the 1950s and 60s, where we really start to see youth cultures become these sort of dominant cultures and really reshape cultural landscapes in major ways. But you start to see kind of youth culture developing as you cluster people together. And specifically, you start to get, again, because we're into capitalism here, people start to see these different age categories as markets, right? And so people start to innovate and figure out, well, what could we sell into this market that would make us profit? Okay, so this is a quote from the book, right? When any group is formed on the basis of a characteristic, it is inevitable that other characteristics will be noticed, right? So you start to cluster people together in terms of learning in schools, and people start to notice that there are other unique things about groups of children. So relatively quickly, right, by the end of the 1500s, right, so only about a century, a little more than a century after the invention of the printing press, children's clothing as separate from adult clothing becomes the norm. You start to get a differentiation of children's language, right? It starts to be noticed, and teaching manuals start to talk about differences in children's language and developing that language, right? You get, the first books on pediatrics written in the West, right, that treat children as a separate medical category, is written sometime prior to 1600. And then you get the first children's books published sometime around, 1744, books specifically for children. And the first one that we have a record of is this one, which is the history of Jack the Giant Killer, basically a Jack and the Beanstalk story, which is the first book specifically targeted at children. And, where did it, not for nothing, where does it get published? In the UK, in Glasgow, in Scotland. Okay. So, all right, should we pause? I want to pause. Do you want to pause, or how are you doing? Yeah, that was a deep and hard blink. Why don't we pause? I'll pick it up here. Let's take is 15 minutes enough, or do you need more time to go fetch drinks in Hub Mall? 15? Okay, so why don't we come back? Let's see, 25. So 40, 240? And we'll keep going from this slide at 240. And I will go refill my coffee because my voice is getting kind of scratchy. Yes. So there's a link on the main page that says recorded lecture playlist. So they'll all be there.
So I might, because I'm not feeling well, I will come back. This is not first.
That's all good. That's all good. Hello.
I have a question. Do you want to go to first or?
Oh no, go for it. I got 15 minutes. Plus the class can't restart without me. So.
I know the videos on, and I just want to check the material will be the same. I know I took your social different classes in the role. I was asking for what is like a deep abdominal surgery, so it's kind of hard to figure out straight.
Oh yeah, so it's streaming as I speak, right? So it's precisely what I'm saying now is there.
Oh, sorry, I didn't know you also stream them live. Is there a link for that on?
Yep.
Or sorry, Canvas.
Yes, here, I'll show you. Sorry, my brain is not braining today. I'm like, what am I doing?
I got my last exam last Monday, so I'm also like.
Yeah, I was just honestly, I'm I really want a 3-day gap, where I just don't have to think about anything. I did not get that.
University should have given that, honestly. That would have really helped.
Well, I feel like this whole we're gonna schedule 3 exams a day should speed up the exam period and give us more of that. But I don't know. When I thought about it, I marked almost 1,600 short answer questions in the 2-week period. Yeah, so on Canvas, right?
Oh, no, part of lecture.
It'll take you to YouTube and
Oh, so you record live on?
technology something.
No, that's
See, right there. That's us, right there.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. I was just wondering, so I was like, it'd be good if I could have that option as well.
Yeah, no, that's no problem.
Oh, perfect. Thank you.
Yeah, no problem. Some double A batteries. I will return. Yes. Yeah. So it's all if you look on Canvas in that top section, there's a link that says recorded lecture playlist. So it'll take you to YouTube, the whole lecture will go there. Yeah. Yeah, no worries. Okay. Where was I? There we go. Okay. So, how are y'all doing? Still here mostly? Nobody fled in terror? Except the people who told me they were fleeing in terror. Mostly they're sick. Okay. So, we're going to keep talking here a little bit more. Where am I at for my postman slot? This guy. Okay. So, we have a few more slides to talk about in terms of kind of the origins of youth and childhood before we shift gears. So we will do that shortly, and we'll get into some talk of the generations. Okay. When you talk as much as I do and you record yourself, you realize that you use some words too much. I use again all the time. Even I realize sometimes I say again and I haven't talked about something before. So it always seems really weird to me, but it's just like, we all have our garbage words, and I say okay a lot when I'm starting a topic. So, okay, let's start talking about this. Okay, so what happens? Again, I did it right there. One of the things that happens, and specifically here, as we're into the 18th and the 19th centuries, we start to get the emergence of modern family forms. And we start to move away from the kind of extended family model where people tend to live in extended families with, grandparents, aunts and uncles, kind of all present and together, to a much more nuclear family model where, it is more typically that a household is formed by, two parents, right? So, usually, always in this period, male and female, husband and wife, and then children that are typically related to the two of them, right? So it's the couple's children. So we start to see the emergence of this as an increasingly normal form of family. Now again, this takes a really long time to become the norm, and probably only really hits its sort of apogee as the cultural norm in places like the United States and in England, somewhere around between the 1930s and 1950s, where it really becomes the sort of dominant family form. But it starts to take shape prior to this in the 18th and 19th centuries. So I'm just giving you stuff and taking it away. One of the things that happens as well is parents start to take on, so some of the formation of the nuclear family, right, and the need for children to have a different kind of care system is shaped by their longer period of education. And in particular, parents take on the role of educators, right? They are in charge of their children's education. Part of this is driven by these technological factors. There are cultural factors that drive this as well. Particularly, and especially when we talk about places like England, things like Protestantism. Okay, so I probably shouldn't assume that everybody knows what Protestantism is, so I'll explain it very quickly. So, Protestantism is a form of Christianity, right? It's a kind of a branch of Christianity that splits off from Roman Catholicism. So you have Roman Catholicism, and Protestantism splits off kind of starting around the beginning of the 16th century in 1517, right, with Martin Luther, and but as the sort of legend of the Protestant Reformation goes, Martin Luther in Germany has a beef with the Catholic Church, particularly around the sale of indulgences, right? Kind of get out of hell free cards, if you will, that the Catholic Church offers to people. Martin Luther has a kind of problem with this, and he goes and he nails 95 theses to the cathedral door in Wittenberg, and this kicks off a sort of split in Christianity where you get Protestantism splitting off from Roman Catholicism, again, starting in 1517, but it's a process that's going to take centuries as well. Now, one of the kind of weird things about Protestantism, I don't know if it's weird, one of the things that's unique with Protestantism as compared to Roman Catholicism is that, and probably owing to the fact that it comes around after the invention of the printing press, Protestantism encourages everyone to read the Bible for them and interpret it for themselves. And so, starting with Luther, but then with a lot of the Protestant reformers, you get this emphasis that parents need to be teaching their children how to read and write so that they can do precisely this. They can do their Christian duty in engaging with Scripture, right? So parents, and it's in Martin Luther's, I think it's in his longer catechism, he lays out the responsibility of parents to their children, and among them is to teach them how to read and write so that they are not subject to kind of, the religious hierarchies interpretations of the Bible. They can interpret it for themselves. So parents become kind of critical in terms of, the education of their children and making sure, amongst other things, that they remain good Protestants. Now, this kind of intersects in England in interesting ways. England is a Protestant country, right? They split off from the Catholic Church and formed the Church of England, or Anglicanism. But England also, for lots of economic reasons that are not maybe germane at this point, England is the first country to industrialize, and it is a country that is kind of at the leading edge of European economics and world economics, really until the United States overtakes it sometime in the late 19th century. But what happens in England, right, is you get a wealthy middle class that starts to form, right? Particularly merchants and factory owners and increasingly civil servants and kind of white-collar managers and such that have more money. And one of the things they spend their money on is their children and homes, right? So the middle class in England, which is wealthy well before, say, middle classes in France and Germany and other places actually appear, uses that money to buy larger segmented homes and to spend money on their children, right? They buy toys and clothes and books for their children. Now, why specifically the middle class and why specifically in England? Well, because they can afford it, right? Because childhood is affordable for these people who are relatively wealthy. And so what they do is they delay their children's entry into the adult world for longer and longer periods of time. And if you've ever read something like Jane Austen, right, in Pride and Prejudice, what you see, and that's in the 19th century, what you see is the sort of rolling out of that process towards its kind of end point, right, where the Elizabeth Bennet and all of the Bennet sisters have been shielded from adulthood for a long time. They've been educated by their parents and, through governesses and tutors and these sorts of things. And now, why? Well, because the Bennets are relatively wealthy, right? Because they're able to do that. So what happens in England, and it will spread out to the continent and it spreads then to the United States and Canada through the kind of influence of the English and the fact that everybody's competing with the English, is that more and more people start to adopt this same idea. Now, at first, it's only the upper and middle classes that can actually afford to have their children have a childhood as we kind of think about it. And again, if you read like some 19th century English literature, think of something like Oliver Twist from Charles Dickens, right? That's the, please, sir, may I have some more, of the porridge in the orphanage. The lower classes don't get to enjoy the same thing. Kids from lower class, lower socioeconomic class backgrounds are still kind of working and probably not going to school as much as middle and upper class children would. So it takes a century or more for this middle class sensibility to kind of bubble down. And what sort of happens is, the middle classes and the upper classes look at their children and they're like, oh, my precious angels. And then they look at, the children of the poor and lower classes who are working as chimney sweeps and they're working in factories and they're working in mines. And they're like, well, those people share the same characteristics as my children have, but they're not getting a childhood. And so they start to pass laws like child labor laws and, mandatory schooling laws in an attempt to kind of move those children into the same social category as their children. Okay, as I say again. So, we talk about literacy, right? Literacy is a symbolic control of the world of young people. And this is done broadly, as I said, when Brian asked his question, through school. Adults control the transition that children go through from childhood to adulthood, right? As they evolve as readers, they are given more and more information about the world through their ability to process it through reading. Now, for Postman, what he thinks also comes along with this is in a lot of ways what you might call the Western mind, right? Things like individualism and individuality emerges, he thinks, from this interaction with books on a one-to-one basis, right, with print. And this is, you might think of this in the same vein as someone like Marshall McLuhan, right? The medium is the message. This is the kind of idea that Postman is reflecting, that by engaging with a medium like print, it changes human beings and human societies in particular ways. So it makes them more individualistic, right? Because when you engage with print, you're doing it on typically a one-on-one basis, right? When you read Harry Potter or Twilight or War and Peace or whatever it is you happen to read, you do so as an individual encountering the work of another individual. Logical and sequential thinking and higher order abstraction, come out, because learning to read is learning to sequence things logically, right? To build arguments, to read things in order. It develops that sort of thinking. And higher order abstraction, right? You start to be able to imagine things far away, right? You may have never experienced the world of Elizabeth Bennet, or, I'm trying to think of another book, or Harry Potter, right? But you can imagine what Hogwarts is like, and you can imagine what, kind of the English country manor is like from the descriptions there, right? You start to be able to abstract things as you read. And very importantly for Postman, right, you develop delayed gratification because you got to sit still, right? To read a book, you have to be able to sit still and sort of still your body and your mind to absorb what is in it. And very importantly for Postman, learning becomes an intellectual and a moral pursuit, right? It becomes shameful for adults not to educate their children because you're leaving them out of the adult world. Okay. So, with the creation of these bigger homes, these segmented homes, you get a return of the private and the public sphere, right? And public and private become important categories. There is public knowledge, things that you can discuss anywhere and when anyone is listening. And then you have private knowledge that needs to be kept away from certain people, right? And that's, things like, you would add to that Roman list, right? So you had, sex, politics, economics, war, which is kind of like politics. And then you would add religion, things that aren't supposed to be discussed in polite company, which is to say mixed company, right? That looks like say. All right, my X is fixed now. Right, and some of these things are only supposed to be discussed in private spaces when, people who shouldn't hear about them aren't listening, right? Again, this is where you get the idea of like the gentleman's club or the smoking room or places that men go to talk politics and economics and religion and war away from children and women, right, in this kind of historical period. Only when you are deemed adult enough are you let in on those secrets, right? And largely because you start to be able to read them at a level where you understand them. So for Postman, it's in the 18th and 19th century that shame returns as an important category with this distinction between the public and the private, right? Where some things are for public consumptions, some things aren't. Okay, I kind of said this already. I got ahead of myself in my slides. With industrialization, right, we get a split, right? The upper and middle classes have children. The lower and middle classes, in some ways, still have unformed adults until you get the kind of children's rights reformers of the 19th century that come along and say, look, this isn't right that children are being treated like this. We need to treat them differently. And I mean, if you've taken the youth crime and society class, you kind of realize that it's about this time that you get legal reforms that treat children differently in the legal system as well. But I'll talk about that a little bit. Okay. So there are a few kind of philosophical ideas that Postman thinks are kind of critical to the development of childhood that come out of, specifically kind of the Enlightenment, and then going forward in time through the kind of Romantic period, and then into kind of what we would call modernity. So, bless you. John Locke. This idea comes from John Locke, and it is basically an idea about childhood. So you may have kind of heard this before, right? This idea that children are a blank slate, right? That children don't have sort of preset programming, but that children are in effect sort of, what Locke called a tabula rasa, right? And this is a particular idea about children that, again, is sort of a breakaway from some earlier ideas. One of the things that, okay, I'm going to erase what I have at the bottom here because I want to give you a little bit of context. So one of the things that you have, with Locke coming through the Enlightenment, and here, Locke is in the good Enlightenment, he's in the Scottish Enlightenment, and the English Enlightenment rather than the bad one, which is the French Enlightenment that ends with, people being guillotined. Well, that's a discussion for another time. So, Locke is making a sort of distinction here between kind of a particular, I would say, medieval Christian notion that children are born with, what you would call in Christian terms, original sin, and that there's this sort of pre-programming towards a sort of dysfunction that comes in human beings, right? That you're sort of programmed to do bad things because of something in the human condition, right? There are natural things that you're oriented towards, and here typically that it is bad, right? And this notion comes to us from Augustine, right? The 5th century Catholic saint Augustine of Hippo. And Augustine has this idea that all human beings are born, they inherited the sin of Adam and Eve, and they are marked with this kind of original sin which orients them towards doing bad. And what Locke says is no. Actually, children are, a tabula rasa, a blank slate. There's nothing inherent in children at all. Everything about children is ultimately shaped by their upbringing, right? So there are no bad kids, only bad parents and teachers. And because their mind and their person is a blank slate, it is up to those people to write good things on that slate, right? It is up to them to put good things out there, to write things on this blank person that are good and virtuous and noble, right? And so this is a strangely Aristotelian kind of notion in a lot of ways, right? That you need to inculcate virtue. So you could call it a sort of virtue ethics. So Locke suggests that children need to be trained, vigorously, both physically and mentally, again, through school. So if you ever want to, blame Locke for anything, you can blame him for gym class, right? If you ever found that you didn't enjoy gym class that much in school, well, John Locke is at least partially to blame for that because he suggested, vigorous physical and mental training of young people, and other things like, shame and credit should be used as a way to get from young people what you want, right? So things like your grades evolve from this kind of notion of Locke, that the good students should get an A and the less good students, well, C is for cookie and C's get degrees, right? So all this from Locke. Okay, there are other, that's maybe on the good side of Locke. There are other things that obviously emerge from this notion of children being, a tabula rasa, albeit what we would say is probably inadvertent on Locke's part, but right, ideas have consequences. Is things like, how to put this? Though certainly Locke would never, I think, have understood what this was. Things like residential schools are based on this notion as well, right? This idea that of residential schools, of taking, indigenous children away from their parents and away from their cultures, and essentially writing something else on this, blank slate, comes out of the same idea that children are sort of unformed and formless, and that if you can get there, before they're programmed with something else, you can essentially be the one that writes on that blank slate, and you can turn, a young person from one thing to another. That's the sort of basis of residential schooling as well. So this idea has negative consequences, not just grades in gym class, but that same sort of philosophical notion of children as a blank slate comes, back to us in all sorts of historical forms. Okay. Other important ideas as to, sorry, I think of my daughter when I think of this slide. I don't know why. Other kind of philosophical ideas that impact the way people understand childhood. One of these comes from Jean-Jacques Rousseau in the book Emile, or de l'éducation. Now, I think Rousseau is an interesting character. He's been, in some ways, very influential in the way we think about childhood, and I think you'll understand when I explain it to you in a sec, how influential this has been. But one of the things, about Rousseau is apparently he hated children, but wrote, this treatise, Emile ou de l'éducation, which has continued to be, I think, influential in some ways. He fathered many of his own children to various women and abandoned all of them because he simply did not want to be a parent. But one of the kind of ideas that comes from Rousseau, he will suggest, and again, ironically, because he didn't seem to care about his own, that children are a good in and of themselves, right? So they are just a kind of unconditioned good that should be treated as such. And one of the things, and this stems from the fact that Rousseau is a romantic. And not romantic in the sense of like, a romance novel or, romantic comedy, but a romantic in the kind of 19th century sense of the word, where it's someone who viewed the state of nature, right, as the state that was most appropriate for people and human beings and all of these things, and broadly saw civilization as a sort of bad thing, as something that had distorted human nature and led us down all sorts of bad paths. And one of the things that, I don't know why my phone just buzzed. It's not my children, so we're good. One of the things that Rousseau suggested was that children's emotional and physical, or psychological needs rather, basically were the closest to the state of nature that we found amongst human beings, right? That where most of us have been sort of tamped down as adults, have been tamped down by civilization, right? We've had our, vitality beaten out of us by having to go to school and go to work. Children don't have that, right? They have this kind of energy and dynamism and creativity, strength and joy that a lot of adults lack. And Rousseau said that, one of the crimes of kind of civilization was that we tamp down those impulses and those kind of tendencies in children and form them into, so-called civilized adults. And so what he suggested is that children are essentially kind of like a flower, right? That is a terrible flower. I don't know. It's a very distorted flower, or some kind of hobgoblin. I don't know. I'm not good at drawing, and this pen doesn't help any. So, what do you do with a flower, right? Well, you basically kind of lovingly cultivate it. You give it fertilizer, and you make it grow as big as it can get, so that it lives out its best essence. And this is essentially what Rousseau suggests should be done with children. Rather than trying to fit them into the molds of civilization, we should, try to cultivate what they already are. Now, where do we see this in sort of parenting philosophy today? Especially here, we'll introduce a term from later in the course. One of the parenting philosophies or parenting modes that people talk about, especially in the middle class, starting in the 1980s, is what's called concerted cultivation, right? And you can hear the agricultural language in there. I think this owes a lot to Rousseau and Emile. So what do we do with kids, right? And a lot of you probably had your parents do this with you. Well, you find the thing that they're good at, right? Or something that they have an aptitude for. They're good at something. Or they have a passion for it, right? And as a parent, you use your resources to cultivate that thing. I wrote cultivated wrong. This is where you see my terrible spelling in real time. You cultivate that thing, and you hope that that brings, happiness to your child because you've cultivated something that they already had an affinity for, right? So what's the sort of modern Canadian sort of avatar of this, right? This is the hockey mom, right? The hockey mom, in some ways, owes her entire existence and the thousands of kilometers traveled from one wretched hockey arena with terrible coffee to the next, to Rousseau's idea of kind of cultivation of young people. Why? This is what you're doing, right? So like this weekend when I was out at the horse ranch watching my 15-year-old daughter do barrel racing in the blistering sun, which is why I have an incredibly painful sunburn on my arms that you can't see because I'm wearing a long sleeve shirt. But it hurts quite a bit. I'm cultivating my daughter's interest, right? Because we found the thing that she's passionate about, and we poured resources, and trust me, horse stuff costs a lot of money. So that, hopefully it ends up with happiness. At the moment, she wants to be a vet, so we'll see how that turns out. She's super squeamish about blood and stuff, so I don't know. We'll see how that goes. Right, but this is all related to this idea, and much of kind of modern parenting philosophy and philosophy about children is aimed at this idea that children have these inherent things that we need to cultivate and build. Okay, Freud. So other important ideas, that shape kind of modern understanding of young people come from Freud, and we won't spend too much time on Freud because I hate Freud more than I hate almost anything. And I always think about taking Freud out of this class because I hate him because he's dumb. Sorry. Freud's ghost. Attacking us. I just have I have a particular dislike of Freud. That's his tail. That's very bad. Okay, Freud is the devil. That's what I'm saying. Okay, so what comes from Freud, right? Children have, kind of psychic urges, right? Instincts, sexuality, and psychic drives. And, these have to be controlled and shaped. And the process of becoming an adult is the process of teaching children to sublimate their base desires, right? And Freud writes about this in a book called, very similar to Rousseau in a sense, right? Civilization and its discontents. Right? So much of kind of what becoming an adult is losing those youthful energies or sublimating them. And of course, Freud thinks that this leads to all sorts of problems, right? because young people, as they sublimate their desires, they develop, neuroses, right? As they, and if you've read any Freud or you're familiar with any Freud, right, you realize how much, he focuses on, especially the things around sexuality, but all of these kinds of neuroses. Okay, and then this last one, and if you've ever taken any classes in education, you'll be well familiar with John Dewey, because he remains, I think, quite influential in education circles. Dewey has this notion that children's needs in the present have to be addressed. And in this sense, right, you can see this as, in terms of how we think about children today, as a corrective to, both, I think, Lockean and Rousseauian kind of notions of childhood. Both Locke and Rousseau, in some senses, treat children as the means to an end. And the end is a certain kind of adult, right? An adult that's shaped in a particular way. And what Dewey suggests is that children, yes, they are going to be adults someday, but we also need to meet their needs in the present, right? So you can't always be thinking like, what will you be, what will this person be when they're an adult? Sometimes children, you hear like tough parenting, and it's like they need to learn what the real world is like, and Dewey would be like, yes, but at the moment, they need a Band-Aid. So you need to meet their needs in the present. We need to address, what Dewey suggests about children is you need to address the problems they're facing and can solve in the present, not so much oriented to this future person, in that Lockean kind of like, you need to write good things on that, and you need to, build virtue into them so that they become good adults. It's like you also need to treat them as an end, in and of itself. Okay. Wait, how are we doing? Sorry, you moved and I thought you had a question, but I see you were just adjusting your glasses. All good. Yes, Brian.
So with John Dewey, when he's talking about addressing the problems in the present, are you kind of saying like parents need to be addressing this one?
Yeah, so parents, teachers, anyone who's working with children, probably those are the two big categories, but it'd be social workers as well, right? Rather than, thinking about what's the future outcome of this person, is like, what does this kid need right now, right? Do they need, additional educational support, right? Do they need emotional support? Do they need more food? Do they need, whatever it happens to be? It's like you need to think about the resource, what they need in the present, rather than always being future oriented. And you see this like very much, I think, that's an arrow, like modern educational philosophy, and I know this because my wife's a teacher, is very much oriented to this, right? It's like not so much what will this person be in the future, but what are they now, right? And where are their, this is the big kind of buzzwords, socio-emotional deficits, right? And how can we address those in the present, right? If you go into the education literature today, there's a whole bunch on socio-emotional deficits, right? So what skill, the other thing that my wife talks about all the time is lagging skills. What lagging skills do kids have, that are not being addressed? My 15-year-old daughter's lagging skill is getting out of bed in the morning and making it into the car on time so that I can drive her to school without having an aneurysm. But that's neither here nor there. I just like to joke about my daughter and how late she is. Okay. Is that good, Brian? That's okay, perfect. All right. So basically, this is sort of where Postman's account ends, right? It ends right around kind of 1800. I'll say a couple of words just about what happens, sort of between 1800 and the middle part of the 20th, early to middle part of the 20th century. And then, when we talk about generations, we'll pick up with the silent generation and sort of talk about the silent generation and what's going on with them. As we go forward from about 1800, right, so we're at the beginning of the 19th century, we get more and more development of philosophies around young people, right? So, people start to talk, say, about adolescence as a particular period of life sometime in the late 19th century, right? In the late 19th century, people are like, oh, there's this particular developmental phase where, people are, going through puberty, and this is a specific and unique phase of human development that we need to think about and consider. And I always think it's funny because, I never knew this until I started teaching this class. The word teenager isn't used, it's coined in 1957. We find its first use, as we would think, in the New York Times, right? So the word teenager doesn't appear until the 1950s. So this kind of category that we have, of thinking about, people as teenagers is a relatively recent invention. And even adolescence, right, is only a concept that's, really 150 years old, kind of at its latest, 125 at kind of its earliest, right? So you get, different, in the 19th century, more and more contention with this concept of adolescence as this different period that needs to be handled differently. And again, it's handled in kind of unique and funny ways. Middle class boys, especially in places like England, are subjected to things like really strict discipline, especially around sexuality, right? And the idea of that puberty emerged, and that you have this period of adolescence with this sort of emerging sexuality, is treated in really funny ways in sort of Victorian England in particular, right? Victorian England we always think of as quite prudish, and it's specifically for this reason, right? People start to really think about sex in really interesting and different ways, and they're like, oh my gosh, our young people are going through this period that's called adolescence, and their sexuality is emerging, and if we don't control it, it's going to go off the rails. So what happens, especially the middle class, are like, well, we've got to keep our boys away from girls. So they send their boys off to boarding schools where they will be isolated from young women and sort of, kept away from the corrupting influence of the fair sex, if you will. Now, obviously, this has some hilariously unintended consequences that when you put a whole bunch of, horny teenage boys together and there are no girls around, they discover each other, which, was not probably what the Victorians were intending, but you do have a not, unsubstantial amount of homosexuality going on in boarding schools. Okay, so in the 19th century, right, outside of our kind of upper classes, you also have sort of problems that emerge and start to be noticed with the lower classes. Specifically, for the poor and the working class, criminal gangs, and especially youth-led criminal gangs, become, a kind of feature of everyday life in big urbanizing industrial cities, especially once you do things like pass child labor laws, right? Well, before child labor laws, young people were in the economy. Once you pass child labor laws, well, suddenly they have nothing to do and very little ability to support themselves financially. So one of the things they do is they turn to crime. Okay, now in the US, a lot of times this has a sort of ethnic element, right? Italians and Irish people form ethnic kind of gangs that will eventually evolve into like the Irish and Italian mob. But the fact that they have, little prospect for good jobs, little chance in life leads them to kind of turn to crime. And this leads to its own sort of weird reaction where, those same middle class people that are start to be concerned about children start to be really, really concerned about crime and morality. And you get what's referred to, can you see that okay? You can, as the child saving movement that emerges in, it emerges in the UK, spreads over to the US, and eventually to places like Canada, Australia, and New Zealand, right? And then, into continental Europe in different ways, where basically kind of white middle class, particularly Protestant people are like, we have to do something to help. And what do? Is they found things like youth criminal courts, reformatory schools, boarding schools, industrial schools, and a youth justice system kind of emerges out of this concern that all of a sudden there are all these children that are, committing crimes and are morally misaligned. And if we don't correct them, something bad's going to happen. From this, you also get, universal public education, universal education as a goal, because not only is it good for the economy, it keeps all of these ruffians, boxed up in a school most of the day so they can't get into too much trouble. Okay, so that brings us kind of to the beginning of the 20th century. We'll kind of pick it up from there. Any questions before I jump into talking about our more recent generations? No? Sorry, that was ambiguous. It was half fixing your hair, half asking a question. All right. Okay. Just get this set. Let's see. Okay. I don't know if I can actually get this to work. Oops, I shouldn't put that up. Oh, there we go. Yeah, I'll have to check back on this in 1 second. Always resizes my stuff. Oh, OBS, you're so funny. Okay, I have fixed it. Okay, so second topic of the day and of the course. We're going to talk about kind of the generations, right? And particularly, all of our living generations. You cannot see what I'm writing. I will write in yellow. Our living generations. So starting with, the generation that's called the silents. I'll talk about them in a second. Now, what I'm kind of hoping to do with this unit is to give you a sense of the generational cohorts that are still kind of kicking around today, but especially talking about what they were like as young people and how we've seen a sort of evolution in our generational cohorts with sort of changing values, changing kind of dynamics, but also some continuities between them, and how a lot of the generational changes that we start to see, maybe even, as early as like the 19th century, have a sort of carry through, and you as Gen Z are sort of the inheritors of a lot of the values of these older generations that have just so slowly been kind of trickling through and building over time until the picture of what we have with millennials and Gen Z is one of kind of the completion of a sort of historical cycle, at least a historical cycle up to now, right? It may continue on with Gen Alpha and Gen Beta. Oh, private number. You got me earlier today. You were spam. So we're going to skip that one. Okay, so. All right, I got to unify these into a single presentation. You follow the class online. You're wondering if the readings posted are optional or mandatory. You're having trouble reaching me by email. Interesting. Okay, I will answer your question. I hope that this is a question from this semester. I actually don't know. The readings, so the readings, it's a good question. They're more or less optional. I have them there if you want to learn more about stuff. It's good, I think, to clarify some concepts, especially if you find I'm not being super clear and you don't want to ask questions, though feel free to ask questions. There's nothing, what I'll say about the readings, there's nothing in the readings in terms of me tricking you, right? I know some professors will do this where it's like, aha, but did you see the little gray box on page 47 of the textbook, sociology at the movies, and I'm going to ask you a question about that small gray box, on the midterm. I'm not going to ask any questions like that. Everything that you need, I think to do well in the course is all in the lectures. I just realized there's something behind me, and I hadn't noticed that before, and now I'm not going to be able to think about anything else. So you don't, they're definitely there as something like an enrichment, as further explanation if you want it, but you don't need them necessarily to do well in the course. And I hope that answers that question. I actually don't know. Okay. So, got 20 minutes left. So enough to get started on this. So most of the information I'm taking here, I've got a few different sources, but the bulk of it is coming from this book, which is Generations by Jean Twenge. So Twenge, she's a psychologist and a generational researcher based out of San Diego State University. Very famous in recent years, particularly for the publication of this book, iGen, in 2017, which made a big splash and sort of brought her to kind of prominence in a pop culture kind of way. Some have accused Jean of kind of catastrophizing in that book and saying, iGen, that was the name she tried to give to Gen Z. Didn't really stick though. Was in serious trouble from a kind of mental health perspective. And we'll talk about that as we go through, and we'll meet Jean Twenge lots of times in the course. She writes this book in 2022, and it's published in 2023, called Generations. And I think it does a really interesting job of kind of walking us through some of the different generational cohorts, how they were different, what their kind of attributes were, and this kind of development that we see up to the present. Now, Twenge argues, and it has a soft spot in my heart, I think, because at my core, in my heart of hearts, as they try to tear the building down around us, I'm a bit of a technological determinist, right? I think technology matters tremendously to how we experience the world, and that the kind of profound technological changes that Western societies have gone through in the last, century and a half, play a really, really significant role in kind of the cultural changes we've seen happening as well. So Twenge argues for this technology model of generations, basically suggesting that each generation is ultimately defined by the technological conditions it experienced in its formative years, right? And here, teens and early 20s, right, are the key years for when you are formed, right? And that shapes your sort of orientation for the rest of your life. And it affects us across all sorts of realms, right? So all aspects of life get affected by technology, things like family, education, work, leisure, religion, politics, and mental health are all broadly shaped by our technological contexts. And new technologies create, generation gaps and conflicts, right? The fact that I'm constantly fighting with my kids about their tech usage, and I have like 4 different apps on my phone to control how long they're allowed to use one device or another, is, driven by, creates a generation gap and creates generational conflicts around technologies. Now, this one too, because technology is changing at a faster and faster pace as we move from kind of the middle part of the 20th century to the kind of first quarter of the 21st century. I don't know why I pronounced it that way. The first quarter of the 21st century. These technological changes are accelerating, causing these generational cohorts to get shorter and shorter. So, when we talk about the silence, it's a relatively big time frame in terms of how long that generation lasts. Same thing with the boomers. But as we get to millennials, Gen Z, then, Gen Alpha, and now some people are talking about Gen Beta, these generational cohorts are getting smaller and smaller. Okay. Part of what she's drawing on as well is what's called life history theory. And life history theory is basically, a way of explaining, at least in part, how the context of what's going on when you're young ultimately shape, in terms of economics, medical technology, all these things shape how people ultimately are raised and how they treat children and all of these sorts of things. And basically, what she suggests, and this is what life history theory suggests, is that parents have a choice, right? Either you can have a lot of children and expect them to grow up quickly, what she calls a fast life strategy, or you have very few children and expect them to grow up more slowly, what we call a slow life strategy. So, fast life strategies tend to happen when there's a couple of things going on. More, when there's a higher risk of death for adults and babies, right? High, especially maternal mortality and high infant mortality, you tend to, do things like, you get married early and you start having children at a relatively young age, hoping that, the children that you have will be mature enough by the time that you pass away, probably relatively young, that they'll be able to support themselves, right? So, more children had earlier means they're more likely to be self-sufficient before one or both parents die. And this, for most of human history has been the way things were, right? People had children relatively early in their lives because the greatest risk was mortality, right? And, 1800, right, the beginning of the 19th century, the infant mortality rate was 1 in 6. So 1 in 6 infants died before their second birthday, right? Which is pretty catastrophically high. By 2020, it's less than 1 in 200. So, it has gone down quite considerably. All right, so that's the fast life strategy, right? Basically, when you're afraid that you might die or your children might die, you have lots of children and you expect them to grow up relatively quickly. And like I said, this has been the norm for most of human history. Or you have few children and expect them to grow up more slowly, right? So this is more typical when there's less adult or infant mortality, and particularly education takes longer. And the big risk is not so much death, right? Not so much that you're going to die from, say, like a preventable disease, or die from any of the things that tend to kill, children or adults, but more likely that you're going to find yourself in a resource-limited environment where you're competing for those resources with a lot of other people, and your ability to succeed is predicated on you having relative advantages. Things like education, right? Or some kind of, talent or trust fund or whatever it happens to be, right? The risk is not so much dying, but falling behind economically, right? For example, maybe not being able to afford to buy a home or to move out of your parents' house or, have a middle-class kind of lifestyle. So in this kind of situation, parents tend to have fewer children and nurture them more extensively, right? They're going to invest a lot of resources into fewer children with hopes that investing those resources is going to lead to those children, being successful in life, right? And again, this is typically, where there's competition for scarce resources, things like jobs, right? If competition for jobs is fierce, you're going to have a slow life strategy in general, or housing, or other things, that we think of as goods. If they're scarce, or if we say have income inequality, you're going to have far fewer children and far more parental investment in those children. So, this is probably where we are. I say probably. I know that's where we are in terms of our orientation. But if you want to see really extreme examples of what you would call kind of a slow life strategy and how competition for scarce resources tends to play out culturally, one of the places that's probably most kind of relevant is South Korea. We'll talk about South Korea more as we go into the course in other parts. But South Korea, right, has these absolutely vicious competitions for the good jobs and the high status positions in Korean society. And, as a result of that, most couples actually today, or most adults, forgo having children. And those that do have children tend to have one. So that today, the total fertility rate in South Korea, so the total, how many, sorry, I'm tripping over my own tongue. How many children we expect the average woman to have in her lifetime in South Korea today is somewhere around 0.68, right? So it's very, very low. Now, replacement fertility for an industrialized society is about 2.1 children per woman. But what you have in South Korea is a very competitive society where there's very few positions in really prestigious, well-paying enterprises and universities and all of these sorts of things. And so what you have is people have very few children and they nurture the crap out of them, right? They give their children extra tutoring and all of this stuff so that their children can succeed in the marketplace. Or, at the extreme end, they forgo having children altogether and focus on their own success or assume that their children couldn't succeed in this system and have none. Okay. 11 minutes. Oh, we can start on the silence and pick it up next time. So, the silent generation, right? So this is the oldest living generation. Increasingly, we have alive only sort of the last vestiges of the silence, but they're still alive, so it's worth talking about. And they're an interesting generation in terms of their cultural impact because it's actually a lot greater than you might think. To give you an idea of how old they are, Joe Biden, who obviously is not looking very well when he left the office of president for that other guy. I can't remember his name. What's the other guy's name? He's not very memorable. Right, he's a silent generation, kind of born on the tail end of the silence, but now in their 80s and 90s for those that are still alive. So why are the silents interesting? Okay, now they are, I think Twenge makes the case that they are a somewhat overlooked generation, right? Because they're sort of sandwiched between what's often referred to as the greatest generation, which is your generation that fought in World War II and lived through the Depression, right? And the baby boomers, right? So we'll talk about the baby boomers in a sec, but this is this absolutely massive cohort that's born roughly 1946 to 1962. That's had just a massive cultural impact. And if you want to see how big of a cultural impact the baby boomers are still having, we'll talk about the boomers in a sec. But I was looking at election stats for Canada, and basically every other generational cohort that bothered to show up to vote, Gen X, Millennials, and Gen Z, all voted somewhat more in favor of the Conservative Party. But it was the baby boomers who voted overwhelmingly in favor of the Liberals, and the Liberals won, because all you need in this country is the baby boomers and you're set. So because the boomers have had such a big cultural, political, economic impact, we tend to overlook the silents because, the silents are a relatively small generational cohort and one that's kind of sandwiched between these two other big generational cohorts. Okay, now that said, most of the counterculture that you probably associate with the baby boomers, if you think about it at all, this counterculture from the 60s and 70s, right, the hippie movement and all of this kind of stuff, broadly speaking, comes out of the silent generation, right? They are the ones who originated a lot of the cultural changes that take place in the 50s, 60s, 1950s, 1960s, and 1970s, right? So a lot of things like the civil rights movement, right? The anti-war movement of the 1960s, the feminist movement, at least in its early days, right? Women's liberation was driven broadly, or gay rights, right? The gay rights movement, or the LGBTQ rights movement, broadly emerges from the silent generation, right? And was really spearheaded by the silents when they were in their 20s and 30s. So a lot of this is actually, a lot of the cultural changes that would cause upheaval in Western societies really was driven, at least initially, by the silents and then picked up by the baby boomers. Though we often think of these things as things that were, originated by the baby boomers. Okay, so, who are some famous boomers, or not boomers, silents? People like Mario Savio, Gloria Steinem, kind of these countercultural movements. Steinem obviously is an important feminist figure. And then, the prominent media figures that we often associate with like the anti-war movement and these sorts of things, the Jimi Hendrixes, the Beatles, the Janis Joplins, were all actually members of the silent generation. So they're a little older than even the oldest baby boomers. Okay, so the silents, for the most part, are coming of age, right? So they're entering kind of their teen years and early, emerging adult years in the, starting in the 1940s, right? Into the kind of end of the Second World War, but then, really through that post-war period. That's when most of them are kind of, the biggest part of them, especially those born in the 1920s and 30s, are kind of coming of age and becoming aware of the world. And they're the ones who experience some of the big technological changes of the post-war era. And in a lot of ways, the technologies that would foster growing individualism. Okay, so one of the most important of these technologies is television, right? TV. TV comes on, TV had been around for a few decades as a sort of, demonstrator technology, right? We can transmit video images over the air, but it really becomes popular in the 1950s, right? It kind of replaces the radio as the, go-to source for information and becomes a popular commodity in the 1950s when the technology gets good enough. And so the silents are the first ones to really experience the effects of television. Now, TV will be really important in different ways, for the boomers and for Gen X, right? Both of them experience television as well, but in slightly different ways, right? The silents are there for the emergence of television as the dominant medium in Western societies. And the argument that Twenge makes is that one of the things that it does is it allows people to experience the world as other people kind of see it, right? And especially this is something that becomes important during the Vietnam War. You get a lot of kind of broadcasts from Vietnam of what's actually happening in the war, and people see it in a very visceral way, right? They see the effects of the Vietnam War through television, and it polarizes, the silents and then the early boomers against the war in Vietnam in ways that, the Korean War that had happened just a decade earlier, right? So the Korean War, I believe, if I recall, is 1950 to 1953. And it generates essentially no public pushback, but the Vietnam War that really starts being fought by Americans at the end of the 1960s, then ends up on televisions all over the place. And there's a really strong pushback, from the American public as they see what war actually looks like. Okay, how am I doing for time? My clock shut off. Maybe I'll say this one last point and then we'll pick it up from there. Okay, jet and space travel make the world seem a lot smaller. So the silents are the first generation to really experience the jet age, right? The age where, air travel across the world becomes normalized and becomes affordable for people. And then they're the first ones, to experience the sort of early effects of satellite communication. And again, the jet age, I think, is quite important because it shrinks the world significantly, as does the space age, right? It allows, communication to become much quicker, but people can experience other cultures. They can go to different parts of the world that only the wealthiest would have been able to do in the past. So it makes the world seem smaller, and it makes them more aware of, we might say, common and shared humanity. Okay, we only got 2 minutes left, so maybe I'll stop there, because I think each of these other points, I'll put a little star for myself over here, so I remember that I was on this point. We'll pick that up on Wednesday, and we'll keep moving through our generations, and that'll give me a chance to maybe add some stuff for Gen Alpha. All right, see you on Wednesday. Have a good afternoon. Have a good one.